Welcome, friends, to another quiet journey through the stories of our past. If you're new here, consider subscribing. This is a place where we explore history slowly, softly, and peacefully. Tonight, we travel back thousands of years. The banks of the mighty Nile, where the heat of the desert fades into cool, still nights. Imagine yourself there, beneath a vast and timeless sky, as we uncover how something as simple as linen brought comfort and coolness to the people of ancient Egypt in a world long before modern conveniences. So dim your lights. Settle in and let the soft rhythm of history carry you gently along. 'Tis difficult to imagine a world without bananas. The long yellow fruit appears in lunchboxes, breakfast smoothies, and supermarket aisles around the globe. But this everyday staple's silent in its ripening, unhurried in its spread, holds within its smooth skin the quiet echoes of colonial expansion, agricultural conquest, and the transformation of ecosystems and economies. Let's begin at the very beginning, not in the modern tropics, nor on a commercial banana plantation, but deep in the lush, humid forests of Southeast Asia, where the banana's journey truly began. Bananas are not native to the Americas. They weren't even known in Europe for much of its early history. Instead, the banana's oldest roots trace back to Papua New Guinea and the surrounding Southeast Asian islands. As far back as 7,000 years ago, perhaps even earlier, agricultural communities began the slow and tedious work of domesticating wild banana varieties. These were not the sweet, seedless fruits you see today. Early bananas were full of hard seeds, with just enough edible flesh to make cultivation worthwhile. But people were patient. Over generations, they selected the most palatable varieties, ones with smaller seeds and more fruit, and slowly transformed the banana into a food source that could be counted on. This process wasn't fast. The transformation from wild Musa species into what would become Musa acuminata and Musa balbisiana ancestors of the modern banana, was glacial, driven by survival, trade, and subtle shifts in taste. Bananas weren't just a food source. They became deeply embedded in early societies. The plant's enormous leaves served as natural umbrellas and wrapping materials. Its fibers were twisted into cords. In some regions, the plant's stems were even used for flotation devices. To the people of the Indonesian archipelago, the banana was more than fruit. It was a companion in their expansion across the Pacific by around 2000 BCE. The seafaring Austronesians had begun their remarkable voyage eastward across the vast Pacific Ocean. With them, they brought chickens, taro, sugarcane, and bananas. Banana became a botanical stowaway, rooting itself in the soil of far-flung islands from the Philippines to Fiji. This was the first quiet conquest of the banana, achieved not through war or trade, but by the logic of migration and the needs of life. Meanwhile, another banana journey was beginning, one that followed rivers and animal paths through the Indian subcontinent and into East Africa. This movement is shrouded in some mystery. Some historians believe traders and migrants brought banana plants across the Indian Ocean as early as 1000 BCE. Others place the introduction closer to the early centuries of the Common Era. Regardless of the timeline, the banana found new soil in the lush, volcanic highlands of Uganda and Rwanda. There, it took root more enthusiastically than almost anywhere else on Earth. By the first millennium CE, the banana had become a dietary cornerstone for many East African communities. Unlike in Asia, where rice and millet dominated, the highland banana, starchy, less sweet variety, was boiled, mashed, or fermented into local staples. It fed empires, nourished livestock, and played ceremonial roles. Entire clan structures in some African societies were organized around banana cultivation. The banana was no longer a traveler. It had become a permanent resident. Curiously, while the banana was thriving in Asia, Africa, and the Pacific, it remained almost entirely unknown in Europe and the Middle East. The ancient Greeks and Romans made no mention of it. It does not appear in the writings of Herodotus, Pliny the Elder, or Galen. It was, quite literally, off the map that began to change in the Islamic Golden Age. Muslim traders, botanists, and agronomists were obsessed with categorizing and cultivating useful plants encountered bananas during their travels to the Indian Ocean rim. By the 9th century, bananas had found their way into Arabic agricultural texts. The famed geographer Al-Idrisi mentioned them in his writings, noting their presence in Egypt and along the East African coast. These accounts mark the banana's slow re-entry into the Mediterranean world, not as a foodstuff to be eaten widely, but as a curiosity. By the 1200s, bananas could be found in parts of North Africa and Moorish Spain. They were mostly cultivated in private gardens and palace courtyards, admired more for their novelty than their nutritional value. The fruit didn't travel well. Ripe bananas spoiled quickly, and the early varieties didn't always suit the European palate. They were fussy, delicate, and unfamiliar. Still, the fruit persisted. It was during the age of exploration, in the 15th and 16th centuries, that the banana began its second, more global journey, this time carried not by seeking new homes, but by empires seeking wealth. The Portuguese and Spanish pioneers of colonial expansion carried banana plants aboard their ships as they established outposts across the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean. On the island of Snowtome, off the coast of West Africa, the Portuguese began growing bananas alongside sugarcane. The climate was ideal. From there, the banana leapt oceans once again, this time to the New World. In the early 1500s, banana plants were introduced to Hispaniola and the Caribbean. The humid tropics of the Americas proved fertile ground, and soon the fruit began spreading to Central and South America. At first, bananas were a secondary crop, useful, but not central to the colonial project. Sugar, coffee, tobacco, and later cotton dominated the European imagination and economy. Bananas were eaten by slaves and plantation workers more than by colonial elites. They were cheap, abundant, and could grow in soil exhausted by other crops. But this humble status was what allowed the banana to flourish. While European attention was elsewhere, the banana slipped quietly into the diets and landscapes of the Americas. It grew with little need for care, survived hurricanes better than other crops, and produced high yields year-round in regions with food insecurity or labor shortages. Bananas offered a solution so obvious it barely needed discussion. And still, Europe did not pay much attention. That would change in the 19th century. Industrialization, urbanization, and steamship technology were about to collide with the banana's quiet abundance in ways that would transform not only diets but entire countries. Bananas would soon become a commodity, a global one wrapped in contracts, political manipulation, and aggressive marketing. And their conquest of the world, once slow and organic, would be driven by something new, profit. But before we move on, pause for a moment with this image. A quiet plantation in coastal Honduras, sunlight flickering through wide banana leaves. Laborers slicing down bunches of fruit while steamships wait at harbor. The fruit that began in misty forests and tribal gardens was now feeding the machinery of empire, though few understood just how central it would become. And so the question remains, how did the banana, an obscure fruit of Asian forests, become the engine of entire colonial economies and the focus of fierce geopolitical competition? By the late 19th century, the banana had transformed from a tropical oddity into something else entirely, an industrial commodity, shipped thousands of miles, sold for pennies, and consumed eagerly by millions. Its quiet conquest had ended. Now, the banana entered its era of dominance. This was the birth of the banana republics. It began, as so many industrial stories do, with infrastructure. Steamships and railroads were the true enablers of the banana's rise. Before refrigeration, most perishable goods couldn't travel far. A banana plucked in Central America would ripen, rot, and turn black before ever reaching the tables of Europe or North America. But the arrival of faster ships and better logistics changed everything. In 1870, an enterprising sea captain named Lorenzo Dow Baker sailed a small shipment of bananas from Jamaica to Boston. To his surprise, they sold out almost instantly. Fruit was novel, sweet, easy to eat, and importantly cheap, with no seeds, no preparation, and a curious, exotic appeal. The banana quickly attracted the interest of grocers and consumers alike. Baker soon partnered with businessmen to form what would become the Boston Fruit Company. Meanwhile, others took notice. In 1899, a merger between Boston Fruit and a competitor created the United Fruit Company, a name that would become synonymous with both the rise of the banana industry and the exploitation that followed. United Fruit was no ordinary company. Within a few decades, it controlled vast swaths of land across the Caribbean and Central America, Honduras, Guatemala, Costa Rica, Panama, Colombia. These were not just farms. They were vertically integrated operations, complete with railroads, ports, shipping lines, and entire towns. The company didn't just grow bananas. It governed the regions in which bananas were grown. This model, known as the company town, was eerily self-contained. Workers were paid in company scrip, redeemable only at company stores. Housing was provided by the company. So were schools, clinics, and sometimes even police forces. Everything revolved around the fruit. And yet, for all this infrastructure, the actual fruit remained precarious. The banana is an unusual crop. The modern commercial banana, the Cavendish, and before it, the Gros Michel's, a clone. That means each banana plant in a plantation is genetically identical to the others. This makes them vulnerable to disease. If one plant is infected, the entire plantation is at risk. In the early 20th century, the threat was Panama disease of fungal infection. That devastated Gros Michel crops across the tropics. The banana industry scrambled to survive. United Fruit began moving its operations constantly, abandoning infected lands, clearing new ones, and pushing deeper into rainforests and river valleys. It was a destructive pattern, but one the company accepted as necessary. Bananas were no longer simply a food. They were an empire. The term Banana Republic emerged around this time, coined by the American writer O. Henry in 1904 to describe fictional Anchuria, a thinly veiled stand-in for Honduras. The phrase caught on because it captured a real-world truth. In many of these countries, political stability, national sovereignty, and social structures were distorted by the needs of banana companies, particularly United Fruit. The governments of Honduras, Guatemala, and others were often weak, corrupt, or beholden to foreign capital. When local leaders resisted corporate influence, when they tried to pass labor laws, tax foreign companies, or limit land ownership, they were quickly replaced, sometimes by bribes, sometimes by foreign intervention. One of the most infamous examples came in Guatemala in the 1950s. President Jacobo Arbenz sought to redistribute land, including unused land held by United Fruit, to poor farmers. In response, United Fruit lobbied the US government, painting Arbenz as a communist threat. In 1954, a CIA apt coup ousted him. The banana empire had made its power known, and yet, for all the geopolitical maneuvering, the business of bananas remained rooted in routine ship schedules, irrigation systems, harvest cycles, and packaging lines. Workers woke early, cutting fruit with machetes, loading bunches onto overhead cable systems that transported them to packing stations. There, each banana was inspected, trimmed, and boxed. The fruit had to be harvested green, firm, and unripped so it could survive the voyage north. Once it reached the destination, port usually New Orleans, Galveston, or New York, Kit was placed in special ripening rooms. These rooms used ethylene gas to trigger the banana's natural ripening process. A week later, the fruit would appear on store shelves, bright yellow and ready to eat. From the consumer's perspective, the banana was a miracle. It cost mere cents, offered instant energy, and tasted better than most preserved fruits available. In temperate climates, it became a staple in lunchboxes, diners, and hospital menus. In the 1920s and 30s, advertising campaigns in the US touted bananas as the ideal food, healthy, convenient, and exotic. Behind the scenes, however, the banana was becoming a monoculture, a fragile one. The Gros Michel, once dominant, began falling to Panama disease in plantation after plantation. By the 1950s, the crisis could no longer be ignored. Scientists and growers scrambled for an alternative, eventually settling on the Cavendish banana. It was smaller, less flavorful, and more delicate, but resistant to the disease, at least for a time. United Fruit began the painful process of replacing its crops, retraining its workers, and rebranding the fruit. Consumers were never told. They were simply presented with a slightly different banana, packaged in the same box, sold under the same cheerful logos. The industry adapted, but cracks were showing. Labor unrest was growing. In Colombia, in 1928, thousands of banana workers went on strike, demanding better wages and conditions. The response was brutal. The Colombian army, likely at the behest of United Fruit, opened fire on the strikers in what became known as the Banana Massacre. Hundreds were killed, some say more. Despite these incidents, the banana continued its rise. By the 1960s and 70s, United Fruit, now rebranded as Chiquita Brands International, was joined by other companies like Dole and Del Monte. Together, they formed a triopoly that still dominates the global banana trade today. They built new plantations, adopted new technologies, and expanded into new markets. But the basic pattern remained: poor countries growing fruit for rich ones, under conditions shaped not by local needs but by distant corporations. In some places, the banana was practically the national economy. In others, it was the symbol of colonial hangover, a reminder that independence did not always bring autonomy. And the Cavendish, for all its resistance, was showing signs of weakness. A new strain of Panama disease, tropical race 4E. In Asia, in the late 20th century, it spread quietly, then quickly. Unlike earlier strains, it could infect Cavendish bananas. And like before, there was no cure. only abandonment. Today, scientists are once again racing to find a replacement. New hybrids, genetically modified variants, and re-wilded cultivars are being tested. But for now, the banana you eat is a clone, vulnerable to collapse, surviving on borrowed time. It's a delicate balance, the illusion of abundance, held up by logistics, labor, and hope. In a way, the banana story is a mirror of the modern world, simple on the surface, complex and fragile underneath. And so we're left with another question. In a world where a single fruit can reshape borders, topple governments, and exploit entire nations, how long can we maintain the illusion that this is just about breakfast? By the time you pick up a banana from a grocery store today, its journey has spanned thousands of miles, multiple borders, and layers of geopolitical history. And yet, the fruit still costs less than a cup of coffee. This paradox that something so labor-intensive and logistically complex could be so cheap isn't the result of magic. It's the result of a long legacy of quiet exploitation, biological fragility, and global interdependence. To understand the modern banana, you must first understand the modern plantation. In the 21st century, the structure and rhythm of banana production remains much the same as it was in the heyday of United Fruit. Fields are cleared in the tropical lowlands of Ecuador, Colombia, the Philippines, and parts of Central Africa. The land must be flat, close to a port, and within a consistent climate band. There must be water, cheap labor, and very little regulation. The Cavendish banana, now the dominant global variety, demands uniformity. Its production process is methodical, almost industrial. Each plant is a clone, derived from a parent plant and propagated by transplanting suckers. These are not grown from seed. In fact, Cavendish bananas don't produce viable seeds at all. Every banana you've ever eaten, in essence, comes from the same genetic blueprint. This uniformity has benefits. It simplifies harvesting, packaging, and shipping, but it also creates enormous biological risk. The entire global Cavendish crop is susceptible to the same threats, and now those threats are multiplying. Tropical race for TR, for a soil-borne fungus that causes fusarium wilt, is the latest in a series of diseases haunting banana plantations. Originating in Southeast Asia, TR4 spreads slowly at first, devastating plantations in Taiwan and Indonesia. Then, quietly, it crossed into the Middle East, Africa, and most worryingly, Latin America. Unlike previous banana plagues, TR4 cannot be treated with chemicals. It persists in soil for decades, spreading through water, contaminated tools, even the soles of workers' boots. Once a field is infected, it must be abandoned. There is no cure, no containment, and no resistance, because all Cavendish bananas are genetically identical. Scientists and agriculturalists are now racing against time. Some are experimenting with genetically modified GM bananas, inserting resistance genes from wild species. Others are returning to banana biodiversity, exploring thousands of less-known cultivars, grown in places like Papua New Guinea, India, and Uganda. These varieties are often unfit for export. They bruise easily, spoil quickly, or look unfamiliar. But they offer what the Cavendish cannot: genetic resilience. Meanwhile, the human side of banana production continues to raise troubling questions. Labor conditions in many banana-exporting countries remain poor. Pesticide use is widespread, necessary to protect crops from pests like the banana weevil and the black sigatoka fungus, Workers often, including children, face daily exposure to chemicals, long hours, and insecure contracts. Plantation life is hard, repetitive, and largely invisible to the outside world. And yet, the demand persists. In Europe and North America, the banana remains one of the most consumed fruits. It is still associated with wholesomeness, with breakfast tables and smoothie bowls. Few consumers are aware that behind each bunch lies an economic system teetering on collapse, a crop held together by logistics and legacy, and a fragile biology that could be undone by a single invisible spore. Some attempts have been made to change this dynamic. Fair trade initiatives have grown over the last 2 decades, aiming to ensure better wages, working conditions, and environmental practices in banana production. Organic bananas, too, have made their way into markets, grown without synthetic pesticides or fertilizers. But these alternatives make up only a small portion of the global banana trade. Multinational corporations still dominate. Chiquita Dole and Del Monte remain the primary exporters, though they have adapted their image. Gone are the plantation posters of the 1920s. In their place, marketing that emphasizes sustainability, family farms, and tropical serenity. In reality, banana production has simply shifted into new forms. Rather than owning plantations directly, many companies now contract with local growers. This shields them from liability while retaining control over the supply chain. It's a quieter, more modern version of the old banana empire, but the structure remains. Even governments have continued to feel the banana's influence. In Ecuador, the world's largest exporter of banana fruit, accounts for a significant portion of the national economy. Entire regions are devoted to banana farming. During market downturns, national budgets suffer. In countries like the Philippines, banana exports are now tied to geopolitical tensions, especially with China. A fruit that once helped fuel colonial empires now quietly shapes international diplomacy. Yet for all of this, the banana's greatest threat may still be the one it cannot see itself: the continued dependence on a single cultivar. The Cavendish is unsustainable. Despite its familiarity, convenience, and profitability, the Cavendish banana is ultimately a product of compromise, stand-in for the tastier Gros Michel, which disappeared under similar conditions. It exists because it fits shipping crates, not because it's the best tasting or the most resilient. And now, even it is fading. In laboratories around the world, scientists are now developing new varieties, bananas that resist TR4, that taste better, that grow faster or store longer. Some are genetically edited. Others are hybrids of obscure regional varieties. All of them face the same challenge: consumer acceptance. Because here lies the curious twist in the banana's story. After centuries of migration, colonization, and commodification, the future of this global fruit may rest not in disease, politics, or economics, but in the comfort of routine. People like their bananas, yellow, long, and familiar. Changing that even for survival may prove harder than it seems. So, as you lie in bed tonight, listening to the wind or the soft hum of evening, consider the quiet journey of this fruit. From ancient forests to industrial plantations, from colonial cargo to supermarket staple, a fruit that changed landscapes, economies, and governments without ever making much noise. And perhaps, most curiously of all, the banana's biggest impact has always come not through its presence, through its absence. A missing shipment, a disease outbreak, a bruised boxall enough to send markets trembling and communities scrambling. So we end where we began, with a simple question. In a world where even a banana can shape the course of nations, what else are we quietly depending on without realizing it? Before the world became small, before we could tap out messages in seconds, across continents communication over long distances was a burdensome affair. In the early 19th century, sending a letter was a matter of social status, economic privilege, and, often, bureaucratic complexity. This was a time when mail delivery was slow, irregular, and sometimes absurdly expensive. There were no flat rates, no predictable schedules, and certainly no stamps. Instead, letters were paid for by the recipientiers, the one receiving the mail, not the sender. Charges were calculated by the number of pages and the distance traveled. A long news-filled letter could cost its unfortunate receiver days' wages. Imagine you were a shopkeeper in Manchester receiving a thick envelope from your brother in London. You might have to pay a shilling or more just to accept an amount significant enough that some people simply refused delivery. Unwanted letters were left unopened, abandoned at the local post office. The system discouraged correspondence, created inefficiencies, and bred resentment. And then came a quiet but persistent movement, rooted not in glamour or grandeur, but in stationery, ink, and envelopes. At the center of it all was a man named Rowland Hill. Hill wasn't a politician or a soldier. He was a schoolteacher, a reformer, and most of all, a man who thought carefully about the way systems worked or failed to work. In 1837, Hill published a pamphlet titled Post Office Reform, Its Importance and Practicability. It was a dry, measured document, hardly a revolutionary tract, but it offered a solution so simple and elegant that it would eventually reshape global communication. Hill proposed a uniform, prepaid postal rate, fixed cost for delivering letters, regardless of distance. And more importantly, he suggested the use of a small, adhesive label to indicate that postage had been paid. This would be the world's first postage stamp. The response was tepid at first. Many in government dismissed the idea as utopian or unnecessary. The existing system, though flawed, had inertia on its side. Postmasters and clerks collected their commissions based on the confusing, distance-based fee system. Simplifying it would not only require changes in pricing, it would also append a familiar structure of bureaucracy, accounting, and personal gain. But Hill was persistent. He marshaled data to show that a standardized rate would increase volume, efficiency, and public satisfaction. His plan appealed to a growing middle class eager for personal correspondence. More importantly, it fit with the broader spirit of the Victorian era: order, logic, and measurable reform. In 1840, after years of lobbying, the British government agreed to a limited trial. On May 1st, 1840, the world's first postage stamp, the penny black, was issued. It was not colorful or flashy. The stamp featured a profile of Queen Victoria, engraved in black on a white background, with the words postage and 1 penny inscribed. It was small, simple, and stunningly effective. For 1 penny, a letter weighing up to half an ounce could be sent anywhere in the United Kingdom. And for the first time, the cost was paid by the sender, not the recipient. The change was immediate and dramatic. Letter volumes soared. Ordinary people, once excluded from the world of private correspondence, began writing regularly. Families separated by work or geography could now afford to stay in touch. Merchants could confirm orders and settle accounts without costly delays. Even lovers could exchange poetry without fear of causing economic hardship to their beloved. Penny black was a logistical marvel as much as a social one. It required new systems for printing, distributing, and validating stamps. The British government introduced cancellation marks, usually red crosses or dots to ensure stamps could not be reused. Sorting offices were expanded, clerks retrained, and timetables revised. Soon, additional denominations were introduced. The 2-penny blue for heavier letters, and later, stamps for international rates. But the idea, the small adhesive label that traveled the world, was here to stay. The reform also changed the physical shape of the letter itself. Before stamps, letters were often single sheets of paper, folded and sealed without an envelope, to avoid the cost of additional pages. But with uniform rates, envelopes became common. Letter writing etiquette evolved. So did stationery design, ink quality, and handwriting instruction. Hill's systems spread rapidly. By the 1850s, countries across Europe adopted similar models. France, Germany, Austria, and the United States introduced stamps and simplified rates. Soon, even far-flung colonies and small principalities had their own postage systems. And yet, for all its sweeping impact, the stamp remained a humble artifact. Piece of paper, usually no larger than an inch square, carefully affixed to the corner of an envelope. Over time, stamps became more ornate, featuring monarchs, heroes, landmarks, flora, and fauna. They became collectibles, symbols of national pride, and eventually tiny works of art. But beneath the surface, the deeper transformation was bureaucratic. The standardization of postal fees reshaped not just communication, but the very infrastructure of empire. Colonial governments used stamps to reinforce authority. A letter with a queen's image on the stamp became a subtle act of power projection. It announced the sender's participation in a shared system, a web of governance that connected post offices from London to Calcutta, from Nairobi to Sydney. Postal reform also affected literacy rates. As letter writing became more affordable, the incentive to read and write increased. Schools began incorporating letter composition into curricula. Literacy spread beyond elites and professionals. The act of reading a letter, once rare, became quiet, common ritual, performed over breakfast, by candlelight, or in rural fields. There's a quiet dignity in this transformation. No revolutions were fought over stamps. No governments fell, but life improved. Systems functioned better. A mother in Edinburgh could hear news from her son in Glasgow without paying a day's wages. A clerk in Belfast could order books from London and receive them without delay. Business, family, and friendship were now only a penny apart. Still, the early days of the stamp were not without problems. Forgery became a concern. Stamp paper had to be made more secure, cancellation marks more complex, postal inspectors trained in detecting fraud, and as volume increased, sorting centers had to grow not just in size, but in sophistication. Trains were equipped with traveling post offices, where clerks sorted mail en route. Accuracy and speed were paramount. One curious side effect of this system was the emergence of a new kind of community, the stamp collector, known as philatelists. These individuals saw the beauty in these tiny adhesives. They tracked issues, compared perforations, debated printing errors. The penny black ones, a common, functional item, became a prized rarity, especially in mint condition. By the mid-19th century, children were encouraged to collect stamps as a hobby. Albums were published, trade networks formed, And in an age of increasing global connection, stamps offered a quiet kind of worldliness. They were miniature ambassadors, bringing distant countries and unfamiliar rulers into suburban parlors and dusty attics. All of this from a single reform, a schoolteacher's idea, turned into policy, turned into infrastructure, turned into culture. But here we must pause, because the story of postal reform doesn't end with stamps or sorting rooms. It continues with the rise of airmail, with wartime censorship, with the Cold War's postal spies, and eventually with the great unraveling that came with the internet age. So we are left with a quiet question, nestled in the corner of an envelope in a world so used to instant communication. What did we lose when the letter became rare? By the mid-19th century, the small, unassuming postage stamp had done something few inventions ever accomplish. It became indispensable. Across Europe and its expanding colonies, the stamp was not just a marker of prepayment, it became a symbol of administration, control, and participation in the growing machinery of empire. Let us return, then, to the 1840s, when the penny black first found its way into public hands. Within just a few years, the concept of prepaid postage began to influence not only British society but the entire geopolitical landscape. As the British Empire expanded, so too did its postal infrastructure. Colonial governments were instructed to adopt standardized mail practices. The Colonial Office in London oversaw not just governance, but increasingly how letters moved from coast to interior, from metropolis to backwater, from governor to settler. In 1851, the first International Postal Conference was held in Brussels, though it would be the Universal Postal Union, founded in 1874 in Bern, Switzerland, that truly globalized the system. This organization introduced a revolutionary concept: one international postal territory. Under UPU rules, a letter mailed from one member country would be treated the same in all others. Uniform rates were set. Responsibilities for delivery were shared. Countries were discouraged from charging arbitrary fees for incoming mail. This meant that a farmer in New Zealand could send a letter to a relative in Canada with the same ease and the same assumptions of delivery as someone mailing within London. The implications were vast. As colonial borders shifted and new territories were absorbed or granted autonomy, one of the most consistent expressions of sovereignty was the issuance of national stamps. In this way, the postage stamp became a subtle but powerful political tool. Many early colonial stamps prominently featured Queen Victoria's, sometimes surrounded by heraldic symbols or local emblems. These stamps traveled across deserts and jungles, across oceans and railroads, carrying not just correspondence but a message. This land and the systems upon it belonged to the empire. But over time, some colonies began to incorporate their own imagery, tropical birds, local rulers, indigenous symbols. These were small acts of visual independence within an otherwise rigid imperial framework. For example, the Cape of Good Hope's triangular stamps, a rarity among otherwise rectangular issues, hinted at a distinct postal identity. In Mauritius, the now legendary post office stamps of 1847, printed in error with those words rather than post-paid, became symbols of early colonial innovation and later some of the most coveted artifacts in the stamp collecting world. Stamps, then, were more than glue and ink. They became tools of soft power used to project authority, foster legitimacy, and reinforce hierarchies. They also played an important role in war. During the Crimean War, the British military postal system was expanded to allow soldiers to send letters home cheaply and reliably. The principle continued into later conflicts. During the Boer War, British troops used field post offices to send dispatches across a hostile South African landscape. In World War I, the Royal Mail adapted railway carriages and even mobile tents into sorting offices. Military mail marked, with special stamps or overprints carried home. Not just news, but morale. Letters from the front were treasured. They were read aloud at dinner tables, passed between neighbors, folded and unfolded until the creases split. In many homes, they were kept in drawers long after their senders had disappeared. Postal censorship also evolved rapidly during wartime. Governments, fearful of espionage and sedition, began opening, reading, and sometimes withholding letters. Even postage stamps were examined for coded messages. The postal system, once a tool of intimacy, became a site of surveillance. Still, the need for communication outpaced these concerns. Across colonial administrations and battlefields alike, the post was essential. It kept families connected. It allowed bureaucracies to function. And in more ways than one, it made the invisible connections of empire feel tangible. One of the more curious outcomes of global postage standardization was the emergence of postal diplomacy. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, countries began issuing commemorative stamps, limited-run issues celebrating anniversaries, events, or political ideals. These stamps, often colorful and ornate, were collected eagerly. They became soft introductions to a nation's story. For instance, when the United States issued a commemorative stamp series for the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition, it was a clear act of national storytelling. The series featured 10 intricate stamps highlighting Christopher Columbus's voyages. Not only did it honor the 400th anniversary of the so-called discovery of the New World, but it also framed the American nation as the inheritor of a grand historical arc. Millions of these stamps were printed. They appeared on letters, albums, and schoolroom walls. Similar practices spread worldwide. Nations saw postage stamps as opportunities to shape perception. They were quiet propaganda widely circulated, inexpensive, and often unnoticed in their ideological messaging. Back in Britain, Rowland Hill's legacy endured long after his death in 1879. He was knighted in 1860. His reform now recognized as a cornerstone of modern administration. Under his influence, postal reforms expanded further. Rural delivery routes were established, pillar boxes installed across cities, and evening mail pickups became common. But with all this growth, problems too multiplied by the late 19th century. Fraudulent reproduction of stamps had become a serious issue. Sophisticated forgeries, some even produced by organized crime, rings flooded the market. Postal authorities responded by introducing more complex printing techniques, watermarks, perforations, multicolor inks, and engraved details. These innovations made counterfeiting more difficult, but they also made stamps even more beautiful. At the same time, the economics of postage began to strain. Colonies that once operated as receivers of mail became net exporters. As more mail moved between Europe and its far-flung territories, the question of cost-sharing grew contentious. Who would pay for letters that originated in Liverpool but had to be delivered by mule through the interior of Kenya? The Universal Postal Union responded with a principle of reciprocity, but tensions remained. Some developing nations began to see their postal systems as financial burdens imposed by outside expectations. Others turned them into tools of national pride. By the 1930s, a new development loomed on the horizon. Airmail letters that once took weeks could now arrive in days at a cost. Airmail stamps were introduced, often with sleek, modern designs, biplanes over mountains, zeppelins floating over oceans, pilot profiles in bold relief. The tone shifted. Mail was no longer just dependably, was fast, even glamorous. The early airmail routes mirrored old imperial pathways, from London to Cairo to Delhi to Singapore. The infrastructure of empire now flew through the skies, stitched together by wings and wireless stations. But the airmail era, while exciting, also marked the beginning of the end for the slow, thoughtful letter. Urgency began to replace reflection. The telegram, and later the telephone, sped up communication even more. People no longer waited weeks for responses. They expected answers within days. Still, throughout the early 20th century, the postage stamp remained a vital part of daily life. In many parts of the world, it retained its aura of trust. A letter, properly stamped, was an unspoken contract between sender and state. It would arrive unless disrupted by war, disaster, or fraud. You could drop it into a box and, days later, someone hundreds or thousands of miles away would receive your thoughts, your news, your request. But the question began to arise. As the speed of communication increased, would the quality of communication decrease? What happened to the depth of expression when one no longer had to choose words carefully, when brevity replaced thoughtfulness? What did we lose when we no longer touched the page, licked the stamp, or waited for the carrier's footsteps? That question lingered quietly in the minds of writers, lovers, and bureaucrats alike. Because by the mid-20th century, new forces were taking hold. Telephones were becoming common. Television was arriving. The first digital experiments were underway. A letter, once the heartbeat of both empire and emotion, was slowly becoming optional. But even then, even as airwaves and circuits began to replace ink and glue, the postage stamp remained a tiny rectangle of history, glued to the corner of a moment. So the question remains, hanging in the margins of forgotten envelopes and dusty stamp albums, in a world increasingly driven by speed, was the slowness of the letter a weakness or a strength? Asterisk, as the mid-20th century gave way to its latter half, the postage stamp, once a marvel of bureaucratic innovation and imperial reach, began to lose its central role in daily life. The slow decline did not happen suddenly, nor was it particularly loud. There was no global announcement, no public mourning. Rather, it faded gently, like the yellowing of an old envelope in a kitchen drawer. But for a time, it lingered. Even as rotary telephones rang in parlors and fax machines hummed in government offices, people still mailed letters. The act remained both ritual and necessity. Birthday cards arrived with neat stamps in the upper right corners. Holiday greetings came postmarked with December cheer. And utility bills, mundane, yet essential, continued to be folded into envelopes and sent across town by postal workers who knew the names of the dogs on their route. In many countries, the mid-20th century was the golden age of the local postman. Uniformed and punctual, the postman was not just a courier but a symbol of continuity. Children watched for them after school. Grandparents nodded from garden gates. In rural communities especially, the postman was sometimes the only link to the outside world, and for all the technological advances, postage stamps kept evolving. Nations began issuing thematic stamps, featuring flora and fauna, inventors, local festivals, historical anniversaries, and sports figures. These stamps served less of a logistical function and more of a cultural one. They celebrated a nation's story in miniature form. Countries like Japan issued elegant, seasonally appropriate stamps. Finland celebrated its saunas and forests. India commemorated independence leaders, artisans, and classical music. Ghana, newly independent in the 1950s, used stamps to showcase its transition from colony to sovereign state. The Soviet Union issued boldly designed stamps praising industry, space exploration, and the workers' paradise. Stamp design became a way for countries, especially newer ones, to shape their image in the global consciousness. The stamp was still, after all, a piece of national branding. Meanwhile, philately, the hobby of collecting stamps, reached unprecedented popularity. What had started as a niche pastime among British gentlemen in the 1860s exploded into a mass global activity. By the 1960s, millions of children and adults collected, traded, and displayed stamps in albums, at club meetings, and through international exchanges. Stamp dealers published catalogues with precise valuations. Enthusiasts memorized watermark types, printing errors, and gum variations. The value of a stamp could be driven not only by its rarity, but also by a story, an upside-down airplane, a misplaced word, or an unauthorized image. It was, in a way, the quietest economy in the world, but the winds of change were unrelenting. In the 1980s and 1990s, digital technology began to chip away at the world the postage stamp once ruled. First came the fax machine, allowing documents to be sent across continents in seconds. Then email emerged, and by the early 2000s, its ascent was undeniable. A letter that once required paper, pen, envelope, stamp, and several days of patience could now be replaced with a few keystrokes. There was no postman involved, no chance of delay, no creased edges from the sorting office. Governments responded by modernizing postal services, streamlining operations, cutting costs, and increasingly turning to parcel delivery as the main revenue source. As more people shopped online, packages multiplied. Letters declined in 2006. The Royal Mail announced that for the first time in its history, revenue from parcels exceeded that of traditional letters. It was a quiet milestone, a logistical success, but also a symbolic end to the era when words traveled with ink and glue. In the face of these changes, some postal authorities tried to adapt. Self-adhesive stamps replaced leucanstic varieties. Machines printed digital barcodes in place of stamps. Some countries introduced custom stamps, where you could print your own photo onto official postage. Others experimented with QR codes, microchips, and even augmented reality. The stamp was still present but less central, more accessory than necessity. And for collectors, things grew complicated. As more people left letter writing behind, fewer stamps entered circulation naturally. Meanwhile, postal agencies began issuing collector-only stamps, limited runs, expensive sets, and ornate designs that were never meant for real mail, but purely for sale. The market became flooded with novelty issues, confusing traditional collectors and reducing the meaningfulness of stamps as everyday objects. Even philately itself began to slow. The median age of collectors rose. Stamp clubs closed. Kids turned to smartphones instead of stamp albums. And yet, despite all this, the postage stamp has never fully disappeared. Today, in many countries, stamps are still sold, still affixed, still recognized as valid. They are used for wedding, invitations, condolence cards, or nostalgic Christmas greetings. They are there, quietly, in drawers and kitchen bowls, next to pens and old coins, and in some corners of the world, they continue to carry weight. North Korea, for instance, issues stamps with overt propaganda, messages glorifying its leaders, and military achievements. Bhutan, once famous for its phonograph record stamps' actual playable vinyl postage, continues to use creative designs to entice collectors. Vatican City maintains a prestigious stamp program that blends religion, art, and diplomacy, and in rare cases, the stamp becomes a tool of defiance. In occupied territories or breakaway states, places unrecognized by most of the world, stamps is an act of sovereignty. The small territory of Transnistria, for example, prints its own stamps despite being largely unrecognized. So too does Somaliland and others in geopolitical limbo, even when not valid for international mail. These stamps declare, "We exist." And perhaps that is the most enduring lesson of the postage stamp. For over 180 years, it has served not just as a piece of administrative convenience, but as a quiet expression of connection, a link between people, nations, and moments in time. A stamp is proof that someone sat down, wrote a few lines, folded the page, and believed that message was worth delivering. It represents trust in a system, faith in another person, patience in a world now driven by instant communication. These qualities can feel antiquated, but that does not mean they are gone today. When you receive a letter with a stamp, whether commemorative or standard, you are touching a practice rooted in centuries of bureaucratic experiment, empire building, wartime logistics, cultural storytelling, and personal expression. You are holding a moment of stillness in your hand. Perhaps, then, the postage stamp has not disappeared, but merely retreated. It waits, patiently, in the background, not demanding attention, but always willing to serve. And maybe that's the final question it leaves us with, in an age obsessed with speed. What else might we have overlooked? Quiet, small things that once held the world together, one envelope at a time. Asterisk, you might imagine that the transformation of a major city like Paris came with the boom of cannons, the chants of revolutionaries, or the flair of grand architects. And while those moments did arrive in time, what came before them was far quieter. Quiet, in fact, that it happened in ledgers, ink-stained notebooks, and dusty cabinets of parchment stored behind locked doors in the halls of the royal administration. By the mid-18th century, Paris was a city growing under the strain of itself. The Seine ran through it, splitting neighborhoods that had evolved with little sense of coordination. Streets twisted like ivy vines, many too narrow for carts. Waste collected in gutters or was dumped straight from windows. The smell was not merely unpleasant, it was political. In summer, the stink seeped into salons and parlors, offending the noses of the elite. And all this chaos so very ordinary posed a threat not only to health, but to authority. But there were men who noticed, not revolutionaries, not poets, not even merchants, but bureaucrats, those dull, determined souls in powdered wigs who understood that knowledge was power and that power was best exerted through careful measurement. It began with a concept known as administrative geometry, a kind of slow-motion reordering of the world. Long before Haussmann's wide boulevards, before the revolution and the barricades, there were inspectors of streets, controllers of buildings, and clerks of the king's cabinet who walked the neighborhoods with quills and measuring cords. They marked walls, counted doors, recorded the depth of cellars and the width of alleys. Their goal, to know the city, Because how could a king rule a city he couldn't even measure? At the heart of this effort was the Bureau of the City of Parasan, a unglamorous administrative office whose job it was to maintain records of urban property, public order, and civic maintenance. It wasn't revolutionary, it was tedious, and yet, over the course of decades, these men compiled one of the most ambitious datasets of the pre-modern world, a precise building-by-building inventory of a major metropolis. They did not rely on memory, they trusted numbers. Each building was assigned a lot number, and each lot was described with details like the number of windows, the materials of the walls, the professions of the residents, the presence of stables or shops. It was part surveillance, part sanitation, part taxation, and entirely about control. To support this, the city also commissioned a groundbreaking project, the creation of a detailed, scalable map of the entire urban landscape. Enter Edme Wernicke, an architect and surveyor tasked in the 1780s with this colossal endeavor. He and his team spent years walking every district, triangulating positions, using primitive theodolites, chalking lines along buildings, and plotting cross-sections onto vast sheets of paper. The final product, the Wernicke map of Paris, was published in 1791, just as the revolution began to shake the very foundations it was meant to document. But its creation was a triumph of precision. With it, for the first time, Paris could be seen as a whole, not just imagined from memory or guessed at through stories. The city was now an object of data. Meanwhile, inside city offices, clerks sorted growing piles of paperwork, permits, complaints, records of structural faults, petitions for repairs. A cracked staircase might be noted in one office and referenced. In another, months later, property lines were drawn and redrawn. Whole neighborhoods were inventoried by height, material, and age. These were not glamorous duties, but they mattered, because Paris, despite its grandeur, had long been a city of contradictions. Beneath palaces and churches sprawled dense, poorly maintained tenements. Streets lacked names or had several. Lighting was erratic. Drainage systems, if they existed, were piecemeal. These conditions bred disease and resentment, but also indifference. Everyone knew the city was hard to manage. What changed in the 18th century was the mindset French officials, under ministers like Jacques Necker and Charles Alexandre de Colonium, braced Enlightenment ideals, not only in science and philosophy but in urban planning. If the natural world could be measured and classified, why not a city? Hence the rise of urban rationalism, the belief that the city could be governed better if it was understood better. Maps, surveys, statistics, and architectural codes weren't just tools, they were a kind of moral order. To impose structure on a messy city was, in their eyes, to impose reason itself. Still, this ideal faced resistance. Property owners balked at state inspectors measuring their buildings. Shopkeepers resisted new codes about signage, gutters, and waste disposal. The working poor found themselves targeted for the very irregularities they couldn't afford to fix. And so, the act of measurement became political. Take, for example, the seemingly benign act of counting doors. In the 1770s, Parisian administrators began using door counts as a method of estimating household size and, by extension, tax liability. The more doors your property had, the more people were assumed to live there, and the more you might owe. It was crude, yes, but it reflected a deeper shift. The city was no longer just space, but data. And not everyone was pleased to be counted, but the clerks continued. With quiet conviction, they mapped entire districts like the Marais and the Faubourg Saint-Germain, recording not just physical dimensions, but occupational patterns, zoning conflicts, and sanitation complaints. One remarkable aspect of this movement was how it blurred the line between paperwork and politics. When you regulate the width of a street, you define how people move. When you standardize building codes, you decide who can build. When you count a neighborhood's waste output, you signal who must clean it and who pays. And all of this took place years before the Revolution. Indeed, some historians now argue that the French Revolution did not begin with the storming of the Bastille in 1789, but in the files of the Parisian administration decades earlier. That before blood, there was paper. Imagine a clerk in 1775, hunched over a desk lit by candlelight, copying building measurements into a ledger, unaware that in just a few years the king who funded his work would be dead and the city he measured would be in flames. And yet, because of his efforts, Paris would still be there, known, mapped, and ready to be rebuilt. So as you drift into sleep, consider this. Revolutions may be remembered for their chaos, but they are prepared for unwittingly by those who simply take notes. By the 1780s, Paris was not just being measured, it was being administered down to its bones. Behind every paving stone, chimney, and doorway lay a trail of documentation filed in triplicate. Each addition to a building, each market stall in a crowded alley, each noisy workshop in a residential courtyard, all of them now required a permit. This was not efficiency for its own sake. It was part of a quiet transformation, the rise of what we now recognize as urban governance. And at its heart was a tool more mundane than even the map, the form. The Parisian state of the late 18th century ran on forms and applications. Before you could build a new wall, modify a staircase, or repair a crumbling facade, you were expected to submit a petition to the Bureau of Buildings. This document needed to include detailed drawings, proof of ownership, testimonies from neighbors, and sometimes even a model made from wood or wax to show exactly how the modification would affect the street. Most of these proposals were approved, but not all. Some were returned with margins filled in by clerks, pointing out violations of building codes that had grown increasingly elaborate. By 1783, Paris had a sprawling, evolving system of construction regulations. Roof angles were limited, drainage had to be planned, windows could not jut too far. The space between buildings, known as the line of build, was precisely calculated based on fire safety, street width, and even the angle of sunlight. This meticulous oversight wasn't only about beauty or order, it was about control. And that control was increasingly being exercised through the built environment. Enter the Lieutenant General of Police, the top administrative officer of the city, who, contrary to modern assumptions, did far more than enforce criminal law. In 18th century Paris, the police regulated markets, cleanliness, construction, labor practices, and even the publication of books. They were not only law enforcers, but managers of the city's physical and moral infrastructure. They used their growing authority to shape the daily lives of Parisians, not just through arrests or decrees, but through approvals, denials, and reports. Want to open a bakery? Submit a petition. Planning to install a latrine that drains into the street? Expect an inspector. Complaining about your neighbor's overflowing roof, gutter? Write a letter and attach a drawing. This paper bureaucracy touched every class, from wealthy landowners to poor tenants. In some neighborhoods, Inspectors made regular rounds, not to catch criminals, but to measure door heights or verify that a certain window had been legally placed. The police maintained files on buildings, not just people. They recorded cracks in walls, unsafe chimneys, and unlicensed vendors. By the 1780s, the police had also begun to map crime, documenting which streets were most prone to theft, which alleyways harbored unlicensed taverns, and which neighborhoods produced the most public complaints. These records informed not only policing decisions, but urban planning proposals. In essence, the physical city and the administrative city were becoming one and the same. And all of this relied on data term not yet coined, but very much in use through action. City administrators believed that by knowing Paris, they could improve it. But this knowledge had limits. For example, efforts to track residents' professions were often frustrated by shifting definitions. Was a man who sewed buttons a tailor or a button maker? Was a seller of bread technically a baker or a merchant? These distinctions mattered because trade licenses, guild permissions, and tax categories all depended on such labels. And here we encounter a fascinating problem when the state tries to simplify reality to fit administrative categories. Reality doesn't always cooperate. One of the most persistent frustrations among Parisian clerks was naming. Streets had multiple names. Buildings were often referred to by the family that lived there 3 generations ago. Some houses had no numbers at all. Others had competing numbers, depending on which agency you asked. It wasn't until the late 1770s that Paris attempted to standardize house numbering, assigning unique identifiers street by street. This was not only to help mail carriers, though they did benefit, also to make tax collection and policing more efficient. Still, resistance abounded. Some property owners removed or altered their numbers. Others refused to post them. One landlord, whose property stretched across 2 house numbers, argued that he should be taxed as a single residence. Another insisted that the number 13 should be skipped entirely, citing superstition. But the administrators pressed on Paris was being turned into a manageable object, a legible city, one where movement could be predicted, space controlled, and disorder minimized. At least, that was the dream. Yet, at street level, reality kept interrupting. Flooding remained a problem, especially near the Seine and in low-lying quarters, like the Isle de la Cite. Despite careful measurements and mapping, the city's drainage systems were still inconsistent. Basements flooded, muck rose in alleys. People built makeshift footbridges from wood planks just to reach their own doorways during rainstorms. Meanwhile, public lighting, first introduced on a wide scale in the late 17th century, still relied on oil lamps hung from iron brackets. These were managed not by the police, but by contracted workers who trimmed wicks, refilled oil, and replaced broken glass. The lamplighters of Paris were paid by the post, and they too were monitored by inspectors. If a street remained dark, it was often due to a missed refill or a broken bracket that required a new permit to repair, and so the system fed itself. The solution to disorder was more forms, more rules, more ledgers. For most Parisians, especially those in lower-income neighborhoods, this administrative system was felt not as a unifying force, but as a burden. Permits cost money, approvals took time, and inspectors, however well-meaning, could delay repairs that were urgently needed. A broken stair rail might become a trip hazard for months. While awaiting official clearance, a market vendor might be fined for selling apples outside the boundary lines, marked on a municipal map drawn 10 years earlier. The gap between state knowledge and lived experience widened, and in that gap, frustration grew. It is here, in this slow accumulation of paperwork, that we begin to see the faint outline of revolutionary tension. Not in fiery rhetoric or pamphlets, but in frustrated petitions, in applications denied, in the piles of paper that shaped the everyday struggles of a working city in the years just before 1789. Paris was perhaps better mapped, measured, and managed than ever before. And yet, the people who lived within that system, particularly the poor, found it increasingly unjust. They saw the logic of measurement being used against them. They watched as building codes protected the homes of the wealthy but prevented them from modifying their own cramped dwellings. They filed complaints that vanished into filing cabinets. They paid taxes based on window counts and doorways, not income. They were counted, but rarely heard, and so the measured city became, paradoxically, a stage for unmeasured rage. The streets that inspectors had labeled and coded were the same streets, where barricades would soon rise. The buildings whose heights had been recorded would soon echo with revolutionary chants, and the very forms designed to bring order would be burned in the chaos they had quietly helped to sow. All of this raises an uncomfortable question. Can a city be too well known, so well catalogued and controlled, that it forgets to see the humans within? By the spring of 1789, the streets of Paris were bursting not only with people, but with pressures that had long been building beneath the surface. The clerks and inspectors, those quiet agents of order, had succeeded in shaping the city on paper, but reality, messy, breathing, and deeply human, was no longer content to be filed away in ledgers. Paris was now a place of contradictions, mapped with unprecedented precision, yet more unruly than ever. Even as the Wernicke map provided a perfectly scaled view of the city, protests were spreading along its streets. In the Faubourgs Vosges, dense, semi-autonomous outer districts of Paris, workers were gathering, murmuring about food, prices, rents, and the burdens of taxation. They did not need maps to find injustice. They lived in it, for the lower classes. The carefully measured city was a system designed not to protect them, but to manage them. The surveillance of structures, roofs, walls, chimneys often translated into surveillance of lives. Every regulation seemed to come with a cost. A baker could be fined for using an unlicensed scale. A seamstress could be evicted for failing to produce a guild license. A tenant might be taxed more for having an extra window, one that let in air but offended the records of the Bureau of Finance. To the educated elite, these regulations had once represented Enlightenment ideals: reason, science, order. But by the eve of revolution, they had become symbols of royal overreach, artifacts of a state obsessed with paperwork and blind to pain. And all the while, the bureaucrats continued. The files did not slow. Inspectors still walked the streets, notebooks in hand. Clerks still copied petitions. Surveyors still measured walls. But something was shifting in the air, something their rulers could not fully perceive. Asterisk, in a building on the Isle de la Cite, a clerk named Antoine Maréchaux spent June of 1789 reviewing housing petitions for the Faubourg Saint-Marcel, a working-class district on the left bank. He noted how many residents had requested relief from repairs ordered by the Bureau of Buildings people, who could not afford the costs but faced fines if they did nothing. One application caught his eye. A widow named Clemence Martin, who had been ordered to replace a stair railing after an inspector, deemed it a hazard to the public. She had no income but was still fined 8 livres for non-compliance. Maréchaux approved the waiver reluctantly, But he made a note in the margin. These cases are increasing. There is unrest in this district. The law seems too rigid for their condition. It was an unremarkable entry, buried in bureaucratic routine. And yet, it captured the moment. A system that had outgrown its own usefulness. Too structured, too flex, too proud to adapt outside the records office. The political storm was gathering. That same summer, rumors of bread shortages spread through the city. Grain prices had been unstable for years, and now, with the state nearing bankruptcy, subsidies and price controls were faltering. Hungry crowds gathered outside bakeries. In some quarters, residents seized shipments of flour bound for elite households. At the same time, newspapers and pamphlets, many of them illegal, began to circulate more widely, printed in secret workshops hidden in attics and basements. These publications, often written by former lawyers, teachers, or bureaucrats themselves, criticized not only the monarchy, but the entire administrative order that had grown beneath it. One pamphlet, in particular, on the tyranny of forms, became an underground sensation. It described the state's obsession with documentation as a form of slow violence, one that suffocated the poor while disguising itself as order. By July, tensions reached a boiling point. On the 14th of July, Parisians stormed the Bastille, a fortress prison that had long symbolized arbitrary royal power. The building itself was almost empty. Only 7 prisoners remained, but its fall marked the collapse of an entire political system. What's often forgotten is that nearby several government offices, including the Bureau of the City Revolutionaries, also raided records rooms. They did not burn every document, as myth might suggest, but many petitions, property files, and tax ledgers were indeed seized or destroyed. One eyewitness described the scene at the Rue de Jerusalem police offices. Revolutionaries tore open drawers, scattering files like leaves in the wind. Another account mentions bundles of inspection records being thrown into the Seine. The logic was clear: destroy the records, and you destroy the regime's reach. Without records, taxes could not be enforced. Without permits, buildings could be modified. Without petitions, the poor could act freely. The bureaucratic city, so carefully built, was vulnerable not to invasion, but to disregard. And yet, not all records were lost. Some clerks, recognizing the historical moment, hid files in private homes. Others passed them to revolutionary committees. A few continued to work under the new National Assembly, trying to maintain basic functions like sanitation, lighting, and construction, safety even, as the institutions around them collapsed. This continuity mattered. While the revolution dismantled the monarchy and its elite corps of administrators, it also inherited their tools. The new leaders of Paris, whether Jacobin, Girondins, or more moderate replicants, realized that some bureaucracy was necessary. Maps were still useful, building codes were still important, and the data collected under the Ancien regime became the foundation for the modern French state. In the 1790s, a new form of administration emerged, centralized, secular, and data-driven, but no longer tied to royal power. The newly established departments replaced provinces. Citizen registries took the place of tax ledgers, and the revolutionary government expanded efforts to standardize weights, measures, and legal definitions across France. It was no coincidence that one of the revolution's signature achievements, the metric system, was born from this impulse to rationalize, to measure, to control. The same ideals that had shaped the administrative city under the monarchy were now repurposed for the Republic. So, in a strange way, the very forces that had helped trigger the revolution surveys, inspections, permits, and petitions also helped the new government survive, and Paris, it remained a living city. Though scarred by violence, the city retained its shape. The buildings measured by Wernicke still stood. The street grids, devised by pre-revolutionary planners, continued to guide traffic. The maps that had once served kings now served the people, or at least those who claimed to speak for them. As for the clerks, many disappeared. Some were arrested, others fled, but a few adapted. In quiet offices in the years following the revolution, new generations of record keepers emerged trained, not by royal decree, but by revolutionary mandate. They still carried ledgers, they still drew maps. But now they wrote citizen, where once they wrote subject. So what does it all mean? Perhaps that revolutions do not erase the past. They inherit it. The Paris that rose in 1790 was not a clean break, but a remix of old systems. The bureaucratic city had not been destroyed, had merely changed hands, and in that transformation, it revealed something timeless, that cities, no matter how chaotic, are always shaped by the quiet labor of those who observe, record, and define. So as you drift, now, toward sleep, picture Paris not as a place of glamour or grandeur, but as a city made of forms, maps, and measuring cords. A city where the dullest tasks recording a stairway's width, counting doors, filing complaints turned out to be the first pages in the story of revolution. And consider this: what other cities, measured so thoroughly, might be quietly waiting for their own turning point? That concludes Story 3, the city that measured everything, how bureaucrats built Paris, before the revolution. You're probably not thinking about a ledger right now, or a dusty shelf of invoices, or a crate of parchment with copperplate handwriting, faded by time and sun. But those are the real bones of empire. Not ships, not swords, not even flags. Empires were made, sustained, and extended by something quieter. Paperwork. Before nations sent soldiers, they sent surveyors. Before governments ruled land, they filed land titles. And before they raised armies, they filled forms. This story isn't about grand declarations or famous generals. It's about the way paper built the world. It begins not with the printing press, but with the account book. In the late Middle Ages, as Europe emerged from centuries of feudal chaos, a new kind of record-keeping began to shape the future. Italian city-states like Venice and Florence pioneered double-entry bookkeeping, a system that could track debts and credits across complex trade networks. This wasn't just a financial trick, it was a bureaucratic revolution. Merchants used it to track goods, yes, but city governments quickly realized they could use it to track people, property, and payments. Ledgers began to spill over into civic life tallying grain, listing births, assessing taxes by the 1500s. When Spain and Portugal were dividing the world between them with the Treaty of Tordesillas, paperwork was already the silent engine behind every expedition. Every ship needed manifests. Every colony needed charters. Every crown demanded reports. Take, for instance, the Spanish Casa de Contratación, or House of Trade, established in 1503. It was located in Seville, but its reach extended across oceans. It didn't rule people that filed them. Every voyage to the Americas had to submit meticulous records to the Casa. What was shipped, who sailed, what returns were expected. It was bureaucracy on the scale of conquest. A ship couldn't leave harbor without a letter of license, and when it returned, Its captains faced interrogation by ledger cross-checking goods, weighing discrepancies, assessing taxes. The paper trail was not just a method of control. It was a claim to legitimacy. By writing it down, Spain made the New World theirs, and other nations followed. The British Empire, in particular, became obsessed with administrative order. The East India Company, the private corporation that ruled much of India before the Crown formally took over, developed a dizzying bureaucracy to rival any European government. It employed clerks, accountants, and copyists in numbers that rivaled its soldiers. And here, the humble tools of office work became instruments of imperial power. The quill, long before the typewriter, was a symbol of status and efficiency. Clerks were expected to write neatly and quickly. Many practiced cursive drills on scrap parchment. Their handwriting was more than a skill, it was a style. Trained into them through repetition, the ledger, too, was more than a book. It was a map of power. In India, for example, land revenue surveys were meticulously compiled, page after page, by clerks in Calcutta and Madras, often sitting under ceiling fans in rooms stacked with folders. These weren't theoretical documents. They dictated who paid how much, and therefore, who could survive. British administrators developed elaborate systems for coding information. Columns were marked not just with names and numbers, but with annotations color-coded, sometimes even stamped with wax seals or colored strings to denote urgency. The ribbon system in some colonial offices used red, blue, and green silk cords to sort incoming reports. Bureaucracy, in effect, had a texture, and then came the rubber stamp. Invented in the 19th century and mass-produced by the 1850s, the rubber stamp became an icon of impersonal authority. You could sign your name hundreds of times without lifting a pen. A stamped approval meant something had passed, been filed, reviewed, granted. It was the final word of the office. The stamp became, in a way, the voice of empire. If a governor approved a land grant in British Kenya or a timber license in Burma, it wasn't a person that made the decision, it was the imprint of a date, a title, a line of ink. And yet, these systems were slow. Files were lost. Pages were miscopied. Clerks became overworked. And still, empires trusted the system. They believed that enough paperwork could justify any decision, organize any territory, control any population. Let's pause to imagine one such office, the Provincial Records Room in Lagos, Nigeria, circa 1911. The room is hot, heavy with the scent of old wood and ink. Iron shelves creak under the weight of bound files, some handwritten, others typed by carbon copy. A young clerk, shirt damp, fans himself with a folded letter while another applies rubber stamps to export permits. The work is not glamorous. It is repetitive, slow, but it is the work that enforces taxes, grants, trading rights, and determines livelihoods somewhere else. A dispute is rising over a boundary line between villages. A field officer will visit, take measurements, and submit a written report. That report will be copied 3 times, one for the Colonial Archive, one for the local administrator, and one for the central office in London. The final ruling may be made based on that one officer's wording, filed away for decades. Empires were built on paper, but they were held together by filing cabinets. By the late 19th century, the spread of railways and the telegraph had accelerated. Communication, but not eliminated paperwork. In fact, it expanded it. Reports were now expected more often, and in greater detail. Governors wrote long reports, sometimes hundreds of pages about rainfall. crop yields, education attendance, road maintenance, and social unrest. These reports were printed and bound, sometimes in leather volumes, for future reference. It was not unusual for a colonial administrator to cite a report from 1854 to justify a decision in 1899. This reverence for records created strange distortions. Villages that had once functioned with oral traditions and local councils were now expected to submit monthly data. Chiefs were instructed on how to fill forms, and scribes were trained to write in English or French, even if they barely spoke. Many clerks, particularly in British India and French West Africa, were locals trained at missionary or government schools. Their jobs were not glamorous, but they were stable. A civil service position could elevate a family status. But it also placed the clerk in a difficult position between empire and kin, recording the world in someone else's language. And so the world turned. As empires expanded, the paperwork piled up. In London, thousands of crates of documents from around the globe were stored in the India Office Records and the Colonial Office. Few were read. Many were kept simply because disposal was unthinkable. Records, after all, were evidence. Authority rested on the belief that decisions were made properly, and for that, there had to be a file. But the system was beginning to show cracks. By the early 20th century, critics were calling the colonial bureaucracy bloated, and detached from reality. Files were lost in transit. Ports contradicted one another. Duplicates overwhelmed offices. One French administrator quipped in 1923 that we do not govern the people, we govern the papers. And then everything changed. The world wars shattered old empires. After 1945, as colonies pushed for independence, the vast paper empires began to shrink. But the paperwork itself remained. When India gained independence in 1947, it inherited millions of pages of files. The same happened across Africa, the Caribbean, and Southeast Asia. New nations used old forms, stamped new names. On old headings, ministries, departments, councils all built from inherited systems, even today. If you walk into a government archive in Nairobi, Delhi, or Port of Spain, you may still find shelves filled with yellowing papers stamped with British or French emblems. The paper endures. And perhaps that is the strange legacy of these office empires. Not conquest by force, but control by filing. A world of drawers, folders, stamps, and pens that quietly reshaped millions of lives. So as you settle into rest, imagine not the roar of cannons, but the scratch of a quill. Not the march of boots, but the flutter of paper. Not the drama of history, but its admin. And ask yourself this: could the true machinery of empire have been a desk, a ledger, and a clerk with a rubber stamp? It's easy to imagine history as movement, armies marching, ships sailing, people migrating. But for the colonial world, history often happened standing still at a desk. The flow of power moved not through people but through paper, traced by a careful hand, routed by envelopes, registered in ledgers, and filed in drawers that smelled of ink and dust. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the modern administrative state had begun to take shape. Its primary tool, documentation. What began as simple lists and ledgers under the early merchant empires had, by 1900, ballooned into an overwhelming flood of standardized forms, statistical tables, minute books, and triplicate reports. Let's begin with the carbon copia. Small innovation with global consequences. Invented in the early 1800s, but not widely adopted until the late 19th century. Carbon paper allowed clerks to make 2 or more identical copies of a document at once. It wasn't just about saving time. It created layers of verification. One copy might stay at the district office, another sent to the provincial capital, and a third to London or Paris. If questions arose, officials could refer to identical texts. Carbon copying created a paper labyrinth. Mistakes multiplied alongside truth. Bureaucrats soon lived under the weight of their own records. Entire careers were spent not just making decisions, but proving they had been made in writing, with timestamps, stamped approvals, and initials in the margin. Each empire had its own way of organizing this paper flood. The British favored massive registries, indexed by hand in detailed alphabetical or numerical systems. Colonial offices in India and Africa often stored correspondence in guard files, a system of string-bound bundles sorted by subject or date. French bureaucracies leaned toward dossiers, with meticulous handwritten cover pages noting dates of reception, notes of response, and cross-dash references. But, in every case, the real power sat behind rows of filing cabinets. The filing cabinet was patented in the 1890s, with vertical drawers that allowed easy access to folders. It replaced the pigeonhole and the bound volume, bringing a level of flexibility and speed previously unseen. For the first time, documents could be resorted, updated, and referenced without unbinding pages or removing stitching. Colonial officers quickly adopted the new model. Filing clerks, often seen as the lowest rung of the administrative ladder, held more power than they knew. They could misplace or accidentally delay a file, and decisions would grind to a halt. One misfiled document could hold up a land grant or taxation change for weeks. Some clerks, aware of their quiet authority, grew creative. In British Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, there's record of clerks color-coding files by urgency, not a standardized system, but one understood internally. Red meant immediate attention, blue meant wait. Green often meant this can sit a while. It wasn't in any rule book, but it worked. And then there were the forms. Forms became the universal language of empire. Land survey forms, census forms, trade forms, customs declarations, labor records, crop reports, education registries, and death certificates. Each one had boxes to check, lines to fill, sections to complete, many with rigid instructions. The logic was seductive. If every district used the same form, officials believed they could compare and control more effectively. But in reality, uniformity created confusion. In Uganda in the 1920s, for example, a new agricultural yield report was introduced with columns for tons harvested, pests encountered, and weather notes. But many local field officers had never seen a ton as a measurement. They estimated in baskets or bundles. The reports returned filled with guesses or blank spaces. Yet the data still went into annual summaries, shaping policy. Paper, it turned out, could lie as easily as it could reveal. The deeper problem was that the system assumed it was objective. Officials believed in what was written down regardless of how it was gathered. A figure entered into a table gained the aura of truth. A line on a form, once filled, could be used to enforce taxes, deny a request, or trigger penalties. Bureaucracy made power impersonal. Nowhere was this more evident than in the census. Colonial censuses were massive undertakings. The British Indian census of 1901 aimed to classify the entire subcontinent's population, over 300 million people, by language. religion, caste, and occupation. Thousands of enumerators were hired, often with minimal training. The forms they carried were printed in English and local languages, but concepts didn't always translate. In some areas, the categories imposed by the census created new identities. Entire communities were labeled with occupations or castes they had not claimed for themselves. Once printed, those labels stuck. The census, intended as a snapshot of society, became a force shaping it. Similar stories played out across the colonial world. In French West Africa, population estimates were based partly on tax records, which were themselves inaccurate. Entire villages were sometimes undercounted to avoid military recruitment quotas. Others were overcounted by local chiefs seeking more grain rations from the government. Despite the flaws, censuses and reports were treated as gold. They were used in speeches, budgets, and international comparisons. As long as they existed on paper, they were considered real. The same obsession with documentation extended to education, health, and infrastructure. Inspectors wrote reports on classroom attendance, noting absences in red ink. Public works officers filed road maintenance records, sometimes sketching in small hand-drawn maps to accompany their descriptions. Medical officers recorded the number of vaccinations or malaria cases in ruled notebooks, adding cautious comments in the margins. Everything was measured, but rarely was it understood in context. And still, the empire of paper grew. By the 1930s, some offices kept entire rooms dedicated solely to archival overflow. Dusting and fumigation became regular tasks. Rats chewed on corner bindings. Fungus destroyed old parchment. Yet the idea of disposal, of actually throwing something away, was anathema. It's telling that the British Colonial Office kept correspondence dating back to the 17th century. Not because they needed it, but because the past was seen as a justification for the present. To rule wisely, they argued, one had to know precedent. Every decision must be traceable to earlier ones. This weight of continuity created strange habits. In Jamaica, one colonial official reportedly delayed a local infrastructure grant for months while he located a memo from 1872 discussing bridge maintenance costs. The logic, if they managed with £5, then why can't they now? Efficiency was rarely the goal. What mattered was procedure. When American forces took over the Philippines in 1898, they inherited the Spanish record-keeping system, Leger's dossiers, handwritten reports. The U.S. introduced typewriters and index cards, modernizing the system, but did not abandon its core principles. Control still meant filing everything, and with typewriters came new kinds of labor. The rise of the typist, usually women, increasingly local, changed the rhythm of the office. Typed documents were faster to produce and easier to duplicate. Filing systems evolved to accommodate these new formats. Memos became shorter, standardized. Templates were introduced. Bureaucracy became faster, but also more impersonal. Clerks and typists in Nairobi, Bombay, or Hanoi were increasingly indistinguishable in their output from those in London or Paris. They followed the same scripts, punched the same keys, filed the same way. Globalization, in many ways, arrived first in the filing cabinet. There were, of course, resistances. Not everyone accepted the paper logic. In parts of French Algeria, tribal leaders continued using oral tradition to resolve disputes, even as French courts insisted on written evidence. In British Nigeria, elders questioned land titles issued by surveyors they had never met. In Malaya, Communities kept private records in local scripts, hidden from colonial view. But these were exceptions. Over time, the paper system became inescapable. To own land, to receive services, to pay taxes, you had to exist in a file. And so, as empires weakened, the bureaucracy endured. Even in moments of revolution, rebels raided administrative offices, not just for weapons, but for documents, deeds, legal judgments, police files. Paper was power. He who held the records could claim legitimacy. This raises a deeper question. Did colonialism ever end? Or did it simply change who held the keys to the cabinet? As the 20th century unfolded, the great paper empires of colonial rule began to crumble under the weight of political change, war, and independence movements. Yet the legacy of paperwork, filing systems, and bureaucratic control did not vanish with the withdrawal of imperial powers. Instead, these invisible infrastructures of governance shaped the futures of newly independent nations in profound and often unexpected ways. Consider India. After independence in 1947, the vast machinery of colonial administration was inherited almost intact by the nascent government. Civil service exams continued. Offices full of dusty files remained the centers of power. Ministries were staffed, largely by those trained under British rule or by their protégés. The bureaucratic culture, the slow-moving, paper-heavy, procedure-obsessed system persisted. It shaped everything from land reform policies to public health programs. In many former colonies, the paper trail became a double-edged sword. On one hand, it offered continuity and institutional memory. On the other, it often entrenched inefficiency and opacity. To citizens navigating these systems, government offices were often places of frustration. Endless queues, lost files, contradictory instructions, these were the lived realities of many. The rubber stamp, once a symbol of colonial authority, morphed into a ubiquitous tool of the new state. Official approval signified by a stamped date or signature became a ritual repeated countless times in everything from business licenses to passports. The stamping machine, now electric in some offices, was as much a part of governance as the elected officials themselves. In countries across Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean, the bureaucratic state inherited a love for paperwork as well as its pitfalls. Archives brimming with colonial documents became contested spaces, repositories of both history and control. Access to files often required navigating complex rules, while many records remained uncatalogued or damaged. Efforts to digitize archives today reveal both the wealth and fragility of this legacy. Yet, the paper empire also shaped national identities. Census categories introduced during colonial times influenced how populations were classified and understood. Administrative boundaries, created for convenience or control, became the basis for political divisions. Sometimes, these bureaucratic legacies sowed seeds of conflict, as ethnic or social groups were categorized in ways that did not reflect lived realities. But paper also preserved stories of resistance, adaptation, and survival. Letters from colonial subjects to administrators reveal hopes and frustrations. Reports on local uprisings expose moments when paperwork was both a tool of repression and a record of defiance. The very act of writing, filing, and stamping connected ordinary people to the vast mechanisms of empire, sometimes binding them, sometimes giving them voice. Interestingly, modern technology has transformed the empire of paperwork, but not eliminated it. Government databases, digital archives, and online forms are today's filing cabinets. The quest for control through documentation continues, now in bytes and pixels. The bureaucratic impulse, ordering, classifying, recording remains deeply human. So, as you drift into sleep, imagine this: somewhere in an office, long ago or today, a clerk gently presses a rubber stamp onto a document. The ink spreads slowly, leaving a neat imprint. That simple act seals a decision, a permission, a claim, and you realize that history is not just about battles and kings. It is about the quiet power of paper, the lasting echo of the empire of files. What does your own paper trail say about the world you live in? Imagine a world without refrigerators, without modern preservation methods. Imagine trying to keep your food edible for more than a day in a hot climate, or survive harsh winters without a reliable way to store meat or fish. In such a world, one humble mineral took on extraordinary importance: salt. Salt, sodium chloride, must seem ordinary to us now. We sprinkle it on food without much thought, buy it cheaply in supermarkets, and rarely consider its historical significance. But for thousands of years, salt was not only essential for health and preservation, but also a cornerstone of economies, cultures, and power structures. Salt was often called white gold. Its value was immense because it allowed people to preserve food, maintain livestock, and sustain human health by replenishing vital electrolytes. Salt's power to preserve made it the linchpin of survival. Ancient civilizations knew this well. In Mesopotamia, one of the earliest cradles of civilization, salt was harvested from evaporating salt lakes and traded along emerging river routes. Archaeologists have uncovered clay tablets from Babylonian times that include salt rations given to workers and soldiers, highlighting salt's role as a form of payment. In Egypt, salt was used not only for seasoning but also in mummification rituals. The famous natron, a naturally occurring salt mixture, was critical to preserving bodies for the afterlife. Here, salt bridged the practical and spiritual worlds. The Greeks and Romans built elaborate salt works to extract salt from seawater. Salt production became a specialized industry. The Roman military depended on reliable salt supplies, which led to the creation of roads via Salaria, or salt roads designed to transport salt efficiently across the empire. Salt's value also influenced social structures. Salt taxes and monopolies became sources of revenue for states. Salt was sometimes used as currency. Romans even paid soldiers with salarium argentum, the origin of the word salary. Meanwhile, in China, salt production and distribution were tightly controlled by imperial authorities. Salt taxes were a major source of income and could fund armies, infrastructure, and public projects. The monopoly on salt made it a tool of governance and control. But salt was not always easy to come by. Some communities lived near abundant salt sources, salt springs, salt pans, or coastal evaporation flats. Others had to travel great distances to trade for it. This uneven distribution created long-distance salt trade networks, connecting distant peoples and economies. In West Africa, the desert city of Tagaza became famous for its salt mines. The Tuareg caravans would transport salt slabs hundreds of miles across the Sahara to trade for gold and other goods. Salt was so valuable that it was measured in weights equivalent to gold dust. Salt's preservation qualities were especially crucial in societies relying heavily on animal husbandry and fishing. In Northern Europe, salted fish was a staple that supported Viking voyages and medieval trade. In Japan, salt production was both a craft and a regulated industry, essential for food security. But salt also shaped cultural rituals and beliefs. Salt was seen as a purifier and protector, used in religious ceremonies and folk traditions worldwide. The act of offering salt was a gesture of hospitality or alliance. Conversely, throwing salt over the shoulder was thought to ward off evil. Spirits, however, salt's importance was not without conflict. Salt taxes sparked revolts. In medieval Europe, peasants sometimes rebelled against salt monopolies imposed by rulers. In India, the famous Salt March led by Mahatma Gandhi in 1930 became a defining moment in the struggle against British colonial rule, symbolizing resistance to unjust taxation and imperial control. Salt was a silent force, shaping economies, social hierarchies, and even geopolitical boundaries. Its presence, scarcity, or control could mean life or death, wealth or poverty. As you listen, consider the journey of this common crystal from ancient salt pans to the dinner table, and how it quietly carved the path of human history. What secrets lie hidden in the salt that you sprinkle without a second thought? By the time human societies grew larger and more interconnected, salt had transformed from a local necessity into a coveted commodity that shaped vast trade networks and fueled conflicts. It was no longer merely a preservative or seasoning. It became a currency of power and a catalyst for wars. Salt's economic value created a web of trade routes crisscrossing continents, many of which became arteries of commerce for other goods, cultures, and ideas. The Saharan salt routes are perhaps the most famous example. For centuries, Tuareg and Berber caravans trekked across the unforgiving desert, transporting blocks of rock salt mined in places like Tagaza and Taudini. These salt slabs were exchanged for gold, ivory, slaves, and cloth in the bustling markets of Timbuktu, Gao, and other West African cities. Salt was literally worth its weight in gold in these regions, and the wealth generated through salt trade contributed to the rise of powerful empires such as Ghana, Mali, and Songhai. The rulers of these empires taxed salt caravans, enriching their treasuries and funding armies. Salt trade also shaped settlement patterns. Towns and oases along salt routes thrived as centers of commerce and cultural exchange. Markets bustled, with merchants who spoke different languages, traded in diverse goods, and shared stories of distant lands. These intersections fostered the spread of religion, technology, and knowledge. But the wealth generated by salt also bred rivalry and conflict. Control of salt mines or trade routes became a prize that kingdoms fought fiercely to claim. Battles were waged not only to seize territory, but to dominate the flow of salt. In medieval Europe, salt production was often a royal monopoly. Kings and princes taxed salt heavily, sometimes at rates as high as 40% of its price. These salt taxes, known as the gabelle in France, were deeply unpopular and sparked numerous revolts. Peasants and townsfolk viewed salt as essential, not a luxury, and resisted the high costs imposed by rulers. Salt smuggling became a widespread response to such taxes. Networks of smugglers risked harsh punishments to bypass official levies. The cat-and-mouse game between tax collectors and smugglers became a constant feature of life in salt-producing regions. Across Asia, salt was similarly politicized. In China, the imperial government tightly controlled salt production and distribution, not only for revenue, but as a means of managing the population. The famous salt and iron debates during the Han Dynasty reveal how salt monopolies became a matter of state policy and public contention. In Japan, salt was so vital that it was often produced communally under strict regulations. The salt makers' guilds wielded considerable influence, balancing tradition and economic power. One particularly striking example of salt's political power comes from the American South during the Civil War. Salt works were a critical target because salt was essential for preserving meat to feed armies and civilians. The Union blockade sought to disrupt Confederate salt production, demonstrating how strategic salt was in sustaining war efforts. Salt's value extended beyond economics and politics. It affected social relations and rituals. In many cultures, the gift of salt symbolized friendship and trust. Salt stones were used as offerings in religious ceremonies. Yet, salt could also represent exclusion or punishment. Soldiers might be denied salt as a harsh penalty by the 19th and 20th centuries. Industrial salt production changed the dynamics somewhat, making salt more widely available and less expensive. Yet the legacy of salt taxes and control lingered. The British Empire's salt monopoly in India, for example, became a flashpoint for nationalist resistance. Gandhi's Salt March was both symbolic and practical, challenging colonial authority. Through the simple act of making salt from seawater, the story of salt is not merely about a mineral, but about how human societies organized themselves around essential resources, how power was exercised, and how people resisted. Salt carved paths through deserts, crossed oceans, and built empires. It bound people through trade, taxation, ritual, and rebellion. As you rest, think about the invisible threads connecting you to those ancient salt routes and battles. What stories could you uncover by following the salt trails of history? As the 20th century progressed, salt gradually lost its position as a precious commodity controlled by empires and states. Technological advances, such as industrial mining, refrigeration, and chemical processes made salt cheap and ubiquitous. It became a staple in kitchens worldwide rather than a symbol of wealth or power. Yet, the historical imprints of salt linger in surprising ways. Modern national borders, cultural identities, and even economic disparities still reflect the legacies of salt trade and control. Take, for instance, the political map of West Africa. The cities and states that flourished along the ancient salt routes remain centers of culture and commerce. Their histories inseparable from the flow of salt and gold across the Sahara. Though salt is no longer a rare treasure, its role in shaping those societies echoes in their languages, traditions, and conflicts. In India, the Salt March remains a powerful symbol of non-violent resistance and the fight against colonialism. The march's legacy continues to inspire movements worldwide that challenge unjust laws through peaceful protest. Salt's journey from vital preservative to a chemical commodity also illustrates humanity's evolving relationship with natural resources. The salt industry today feeds not only our need for seasoning but also chemical, pharmaceutical, and industrial sectors. Yet concerns about environmental impacts such as salt mining's effect on landscapes and water supplies. Ongoing challenges. Culturally, salt retains its symbolic power. Weddings, religious rituals, and hospitality traditions around the world still use salt as a token of purity, protection, and goodwill. This ancient mineral continues to connect us to the past in subtle, meaningful ways. Furthermore, salt teaches us about human resilience and adaptability. Societies learned to harness this mineral to survive harsh climates, feed growing populations, and build complex economies. They innovated technologies for extraction, transport, and storage that laid foundations for modern industry. Reflecting on salt's vast and winding History encourages us to appreciate the seemingly mundane elements that quietly shape civilization. It invites us to consider how our everyday experiences, like sprinkling salt on food, are linked to centuries of survival strategies, economic struggles, and cultural rituals. So, as you drift into sleep, imagine the ancient caravans crossing, deserts under starry skies, the clatter of Roman salt traders along dusty roads, the quiet dignity of protesters walking to the sea to claim their right to salt. What other ordinary things around you carry stories of endurance, conflict, and change? If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to subscribe